from all ages, from all occupations, from all walks of life, in terms of what are they experiencing when they have to deal with administrative procedures. How much do they know about the rules and regulations in Vietnam, and how do they perceive that they are being treated by public officials and civil servants. It's the voice of the Vietnamese citizens, so to speak, and it conveys a message in terms of how can we support all these efforts that the government of Vietnam is putting to improve performance. PAPI measures 6 aspects of governance and public administration, and those 6 aspects comes from Vietnamese rules and regulations. They come from what the laws and the reforms that the government is implementing, and then we translate that into how do they have to be experienced by Vietnamese citizens. These 6 areas: participation at local level, transparency, control of corruption, vertical accountability, public administrative procedures, and service delivery. 6 main dimensions that try to understand how all these reform efforts are having an impact on the beneficiaries. Under these 6 dimensions, there are 22 sub-dimensions, more specific things that we'll be discussing later on. For example, in dimension number 2, about transparency, we try to capture how much citizens are aware of things that governments at the provincial level have to make available to citizens. For example, land use plans, commune level budgets, and poor households lists that, according to the regulations, have to be discussed and shared at the local level. And at the end, what PAPI does is it's a barometer. Or think of PAPI as a mirror, in the sense that it provides a reflection of what is happening at the provincial level. Now, if you don't like the mirror, don't blame the mirror. Blame the reflection of what that mirror is telling us in terms of the service and the governance and the public administration. Trends. This is, perhaps the first finding. A great deal of consistency. When we compare 2011 results with 2012, we see that in terms of mean scores by province, when we aggregate the mean scores of all 63 provinces, we see a great deal of consistency. Except on the issue of participation, there seems to be a reduction in terms of opportunities for participation, in terms of voluntary contributions, and in terms of monitoring of local level projects that Vietnamese citizens have to participate. But there are some positive increases in terms of control of corruption, in terms of transparency, and in terms of service delivery. But the changes are not statistically significant. They're very marginal, and they corroborate that, yes, the reform is having some effects, but not as fast as it has been expected or it has been announced. The other way to look at this is the distribution of provinces. And how do they fit into this process? And what we have here is the distribution of the maximum scoring province and the lowest scoring province. The red dot is the median province. It distributes the provinces half across the distribution in 2011 or 2012 for all the 6 dimensions. And basically what this slide is saying is that distribution is getting better. Provinces seem to be converging one year to another towards the median, and in all median scores there is a slight increase, especially on control of corruption. Right? The median provinces is moving up, and they are moving closer. That means that we have much less variation and more homogeneity, consistency of scores across provinces. And that makes sense, because basically what we are doing is that we are asking the same questions for all 63 provinces. And we need to have the consistency of the implementation of that policy. Now, governance doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in an overall development context. In the case of the Vietnamese context, it's a transition from a low-income country to a middle-income country. So what we found, first of all, is or what we're trying to capture is how are all those services provided in this context. We found that there's a great deal of optimism about the economic situation. In other words, the Vietnamese people are happy people. Right? They feel satisfied largely with their economic opportunities. Right? When we ask, how do you rate your economic situation compared to 5 years ago, when Vietnam was not a middle-income country, then we see that a lot of people will say that they feel better, 59% on average, with the exception of ethnic minorities, which is still lagging behind in terms of opportunities, and all this growth is providing those economic conditions. But then, what also PAPI does, and we also captured last year, is the effects of the economic crisis, or the slowdown of the growth rates in Vietnam. When we ask, how do you think that your economic situation will be in the next 5 years, we see a slight reduction in terms of their prospects for their own personal economic situation. And we see a high increase in terms of uncertainty. And there's a great deal of uncertainty in terms of what the next 5 years will look like. This is important because this will shape, these levels of optimism will shape the experiences that we found in our survey. Interestingly, these high levels of optimism do not translate in awareness of knowledge of regulations. Land use plans, for example, very consistent. 8 out of 10 Vietnamese citizens are still not aware of those land use plans. 2012 was a year of open discussion about land issues, but not about the land plans, and the opportunities to comment on those land plans for that 20% that says, yes, I know what the land plan is for my community, have not significantly increased. So there is still limited transparency in land plans that give rooms for abuses at the local level. But the good spot here is that for the people that are aware of those land use plans, their source of information comes from local authorities. So it seems to be indicated that there is an attempt from local governments to outreach the citizens, to inform about the land use plans. And perhaps other sources like media might be falling behind in terms of informing about the land use plan. Media has been very good informing about the issues, but perhaps not so much about the land plans and communicate all those strategies. Public administration is an area that we have been discussing in Vietnam for many years, that we are trying to understand how the Vietnamese relate to that process. The starting point for us is to what extent Vietnamese citizens perceive that the providers of those services are people with merits, or they get to their position because of nepotism, because of patronage. And this graph basically shows that citizens perceive greater importance of connections to get a job rather than merit. That diminishes the quality of the services that they receive. Only 1/4 of citizens think that connections are not important. For the rest of the people think that if I want to have a job, it's not about what I know or what are my skills, but who do I know that can get me a job in any of these 5 key positions that we are measuring. We believe that this determines the quality of the public service and the quality of the procedures that they are delivered later on. This slide is almost exactly a copy-paste from last year's result. So it hasn't changed the situation from 2011 to 2012. Then we also found that there is a great deal of optimism. When we ask citizens, how satisfied are you when you have to deal with a certification procedure or a land use right certificate, the administrative aspect of that. And we found very high levels of satisfaction. And then we thought, well, maybe there's a disconnection. If we have all these high levels of satisfaction, then we need to start thinking about what are the drivers of those satisfaction. Right? And then we go a little bit deeper this year in the analysis, and then what we find is that we have a combination of infrastructure and human resource related aspects that drive those satisfaction of citizens towards procedure. So, for example, for citizens who applied for, let's say, a land use right certificate in 2011, if they felt that the official that was dealing with their procedure was not competent or showed some levels of unrespect, their satisfaction dramatically dropped to 65%. Right? That is about the human face, the human interaction of that procedure. The same for certification procedures. When the public officials are unrespectful or are not clear in terms of providing the deadlines, all this satisfaction sharply reduced. And that's basically telling us the next stage of the administrative procedure reform has to deal not only with the infrastructure aspects, with the one-stop shops, but also the training of the public officials behind those one-stop shops. Right? That they have the competence, they have the qualities, they have the abilities to provide those services according to the rules and the regulations. In public service delivery, we do exactly the same, and then we find, in terms of health issues at the district level, or also public primary school, in terms of education, for example, teachers, when parents feel that teachers are not competent or unqualified, satisfaction towards public primary school significantly drops by half of the respondents. In terms of health issues, is the issue of not being treated with respect and lack of regular visits by the health staff. Now, one area in which also PAPI puts a lot of emphasis, and that's because of the dynamics in Vietnam, is the issue of corruption. And what we try to do is try to understand both the perception but also the experience of corruption. When it comes to the perceptions, what we are finding is that citizens largely agree that there is a tendency to pay more informal payments, more bribery on very specific issues. In every single aspect that we measure, 6 different aspects in 2011 and 2012, there seems to be an increase in terms of whether citizens agree or somewhat agree to that statement. Right? For paying for a job in the state sector, an increase from 29% in 2011 to 44% in 2012. Right? But what is interesting here is that the strong opinions, the people that agree strongly, has also increased. The perception that they have to pay for a construction permit, teachers in the school, healthcare, has increased from 31% in 2011 to 42% in 2012. This impacts the quality of those services, and this impacts the quality of governance and the quality of public administration, and perhaps creates an unlevel playing field. Now, this is my last slide, I believe, and basically what we are trying to do is we are trying to pioneer, to quantify in a statistical way the frequency and the amount of money that Vietnamese have to pay for their procedures. I will not want to go into the details in terms of the methodology and the statistics, but overall, this is the result. What we do is that we have two estimates. A conservative approach in terms of what would be the minimum frequency and payment, and a more speculative approach in terms of what would be the maximum or the higher ends of these informal payments. We all know that it happens, right? And now we have a range in which we can think about how do we deal and how do the government supports these processes. So, for example, right, the conservative estimate, right, seems to indicate that this is a small amount of money. Right? Land use certificates, for example, right? The conservative estimate says that 70% of citizens who apply for a land use right certificate pay 123,000 Vietnamese dong for that certificate. That certificates are meant to be free in the first instance, according to the regulation, mostly. Right? There is an expectation that in 2013, 6 million land use right certificates will be granted. If this estimate is correct, it means that out of those 6 million certificates, 17% will have some sort of informal payment. Right? 1.2 million certificates that will have an envelope of $123,000. How much is that? In 1 year, about $6.5 million. Then the number doesn't seem so small, and we start seeing how significant it is. Now, the more speculative approach would say that around 60% of applicants will pay nearly 1 million Vietnamese dollars. And then the number increases exponentially. The same for education, right? 12% of parents will pay around 100,000 per child per semester. How many school children are there in Vietnam? And then we can magnify the magnitude. Basically, what it does is that it has a significant impact on a proportion of citizens. The amounts that are paid are substantial when we compare to other costs of other activities in Vietnam, and it creates an unlevel playing field in terms of citizens with different and household economic situations. It's not the same $123,000 in Hanoi than $123,000 in Lao Cai, or Dien Bien, or other poor provinces. I think that my time's up. This is also in terms of a demonstration on how difficult it is, on how entrenched the practice seems to be. There seems to be a tolerance towards these payments, right? Vietnamese citizens are, around a quarter of them will say that they will never denounce any amount that is requested in terms of informal payments, either for a commune police officer, from a commune police officer, or from a commune officials. Right? 1/4 of Vietnamese citizens have said that if they experience that there is a request from either of these two public officials, they will not denounce that request for an informal payment. And the other half will only think about denouncing if the amount is larger than $500,000. It seems that to indicate that there's a high level of tolerance towards these small amounts of bribery, but also it indicates that citizens might initiate the practice in order to circumvent all these troublesome procedures, to circumvent dealing with unqualified providers, to circumvent dealing with providers that do not treat them with respect, and so forth. And also, it also says that the previous estimate that we have on corruption is only one small part. As somebody has said, it's just the tip of the iceberg. Right? There's a significant amount of corruption that goes unreported, and that for the harder that we try to capture and measure that, that will be statistically very different. But at least now we have an estimate, and then we can start working on that estimate of corruption. Now, what I have just presented is a snapshot of Vietnam as one large province, right? And this is what PAPI does. It has two different levels of information. Dr. Zhang will now present a disaggregation of the results by province on the 6 dimensions that we have measured. Thank you very much.